Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a pretty fundamental question for anyone involved in learning, really. What actually drives us? We're zooming in on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation.
Yeah, and right off the bat, most people have a strong gut feeling about this.
Mm,
The common idea, or maybe worry, is that those external things, grades, maybe praise, can actually backfire.
Backfire how?
Well, they might dampen that natural curiosity, that love of learning, just for the sake of it. It's like the joy gets kind of pushed aside when the focus shifts totally to the reward.
Right, exactly. There's this assumption, it feels pretty widespread, that these two types of motivation, wanting to learn because you're genuinely into it versus wanting to learn to, I don't know, get a good grade or something else, are basically incompatible, like they're fighting each other.
But is it always that simple? That black and white. That's really what we want to dig into today. We're looking at some interesting research from UC Berkeley's Teaching Learning Project, and they offer a slightly different take, a more nuanced view. They explore when these motivations might actually coexist, maybe even feed off each other.
In this Berkeley research, it focused on undergrads, right?
It did, yeah.
Mhm.
But the issues it raises about motivation, they definitely feel broader. I mean, if you've ever tried to learn something new or motivate a team at work or even just figure out your own drive, well, this stuff is probably relevant.
Okay, sounds good. So let's start by unpacking that traditional worry, the one about rewards messing things up.
Okay, so the core concern is that when you bring in these extrinsic motivators and in education, grades are just so dominant, you risk making the actual learning feel secondary.
Mm.
The focus shifts from understanding something new, that aha moment, to just getting the grade.
And there's a specific term for this, isn't there? The over-justification effect that kind of gets right to the heart of it.
Exactly. That's the key idea. Basically, if someone is already doing something purely because they enjoy it, they're intrinsically motivated, and then you start rewarding them for it.
Like paying them or giving them a gold star.
Right. Paradoxically, that can actually decrease their original intrinsic motivation. The internal thinking sort of becomes, huh, if I'm being paid or rewarded to do this, maybe it's not something I'd actually do just for fun.
So the external reward somehow undercuts or hijacks that internal drive you had.
That's the theory, yeah.
And you see this playing out big time in schools. You mentioned grades. They're not just feedback, they have huge weight, right? For self-worth, future opportunities.
Oh, absolutely. This research really highlights that. For a lot of college students, getting those high grades isn't just a nice bonus. It's often their main reason for being there, their primary goal.
More so than actually wanting to expand their knowledge or tackle a challenging subject.
Often, yes. According to this study's findings, students frequently rated getting high grades higher than goals, like increasing knowledge or enjoying a personal challenge.
Wow. Okay, so that really makes you wonder then. In that kind of environment, this high-stakes, grade-focused system, can that genuine interest, that intrinsic motivation, really survive? Or is it constantly being overshadowed by the pressure to perform?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the Berkeley researchers, they started thinking, maybe this conflict we perceive isn't inherent. Maybe it's partly down to how we've traditionally defined intrinsic motivation.
Ah, okay, so they question the definitions themselves.
Exactly. They look closely at three common ways people think about and define intrinsic motivation, and they found some potential issues with each. Let's maybe start with the first one, the experimental-based definition.
Okay, what's the gist of that one?
Well, in many lab studies, intrinsic motivation is basically defined as doing a task without any obvious tangible reward. It's all about pursuing something purely for the inherent satisfaction or interest in the activity itself.
Seems straightforward enough. No reward, just the task.
It does seem straightforward, but the researchers argued it's maybe a bit unrealistic. In the real world, people usually anticipate some kind of payoff, even if it's just feeling good about themselves or avoiding feeling dumb later.
Hmm.
And when they talked to students, they found that even seemingly intrinsic behaviors like doing extra reading or really putting effort into an assignment weren't always purely about the joy of learning.
What else was driving it?
Well, sometimes it was fear of a future test, or hoping it might bump up their grade eventually, or maybe just wanting to impress the professor. So, defining intrinsic motivation as completely separate from any anticipated payoff, it just didn't quite seem to match what students were actually experiencing.
Right, so even those intrinsic actions often had some maybe subtle extrinsic calculations mixed in.
That's a good way to put it. The key insight there is that this clean separation might be more of a lab construct than a real-world reality.
Okay, so what's the second definition they looked at?
That's what they call the person or trait paradigm. This view treats intrinsic motivation more like a stable personality characteristic. Some people are just naturally more intrinsically driven, others are more extrinsically driven.
Like you're wired one way or the other?
Sort of.
Hmm?
And this often leads to thinking of them as opposites on a single scale, like the more extrinsic you are, the less intrinsic you must be.
Okay, I can see the problem there too. It feels a bit either.
Exactly. It acknowledges intrinsic motivation is real, but it still implies they're fundamentally incompatible. But what about the student who genuinely loves the subject and is really pleased to get an A? This model doesn't easily account for that.
Right, it doesn't allow for being high in both or maybe even low in both.
Precisely. The research started suggesting that maybe these tendencies towards intrinsic enjoyment and towards seeking external rewards might actually be independent dimensions, not opposite ends of one spectrum.
Interesting, so you could be motivated by both simultaneously? What about the third definition?
That's the reward paradigm. Probably the most common way we think about it now. It simply says intrinsic motivation stems from the pleasure and satisfaction inherent in the activity itself.
Like solving a puzzle just for the fun of it.
Right. While extrinsic motivation is driven by wanting to get those separate external payoffs, praise, money, grades, whatever.
Okay, and again, that implies they're separate drivers.
It does. And the limitation they saw here is that it again suggests these two can't really work together, or might even undermine each other. But think about everyday life. People turn hobbies they love into careers, right?
Yep, definitely.
Does getting paid for something you're passionate about automatically kill the passion? Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Sometimes the money, the extrinsic reward, actually supports the intrinsic motivation by providing resources, allowing you to dedicate more time to it.
Like that magician example they mentioned. Getting paid for doing tricks lets them buy better props or travel to magic conventions, fueling their passion further.
Exactly. So the key insight they drew here was that the purpose or function of the reward might matter more than just whether it's tangible or external. Is it controlling you or is it enabling you?
Okay, so these traditional ways of looking at it often set up this intrinsic versus extrinsic conflict. But the Berkeley team proposed a different angle, using need achievement theory.
Precisely. They suggested that instead of just focusing on the type of reward, internal versus external, it's more fruitful to look at the reasons behind a person's striving. Why are they pursuing that goal? And they drew heavily on need achievement theory, particularly the distinction researchers like Atkinson and McClelland made between the motive to approach success and the motive to avoid failure.
Okay, approach success versus avoid failure. How does that framework help understand what's going on, especially in a grade-focused environment like college?
Well, it acknowledges that we can have multiple motives operating at the same time, and these motives might be independent. So a student can genuinely value learning, approach success, and be concerned about getting good grades, which could be either approach success or avoid failure. The crucial thing is to understand why they want those grades.
And this ties into how we link achievement to our sense of self-worth, doesn't it?
Absolutely. In many societies, and certainly in competitive academic settings, your ability to achieve can become deeply intertwined with your feeling of personal value. This makes grades incredibly significant, but why they're significant differs.
How so?
Well, you have what they call success-oriented students. They have a strong approach motivation. For them, ability is a tool to achieve personally meaningful goals, satisfying curiosity, mastering a challenge. Success feels like personal growth. It's inherently satisfying, which aligns well with intrinsic motivation.
Okay, so they want the good grade, but it represents mastery or understanding to them.
Largely, yes. Then you have students who are more driven by the avoidance motive, the fear of failure.
Right. What's their focus?
For them, the primary goal isn't necessarily mastering the material, but protecting their sense of competence, avoiding looking incapable. Success is defined more in terms of not failing, or maybe outperforming others.
So the researchers argue that the real threat to genuine intrinsic engagement isn't necessarily the existence of grades or other external rewards.
But rather the prevalence of these avoidance goals, driven by the fear of failure. That anxiety, that pressure to protect self-worth can crowd out the enjoyment of learning itself.
That makes sense. They mentioned students reporting they didn't pursue interesting side topics because they were too busy scrambling for grades, right?
Exactly. That fear-driven scramble creates a conflict between simply acquiring knowledge for the test and genuinely appreciating or exploring it. It narrows the focus.
So it really comes down to the reasons someone is striving for those good grades. If it's primarily to impress others or avoid the shame of failure, then learning is just instrumental, a means to an end.
Right. But if grades are viewed more as feedback, as indicators of progress towards understanding a more task-oriented perspective, then the achievement itself, the grade, can be appreciated for its positive aspects without necessarily killing the intrinsic interest.
So, wanting good grades and genuinely caring about learning are not always incompatible. The why matters immensely.
That's the core argument. And this led them to develop what they called a quadrupolar model of motivation, building on Atkinson's idea.
Quadrupolar, meaning four types. How does that break down?
Yeah, Atkinson suggested that the motive to approach success and the motive to avoid failure are independent dimensions. So you can be high or low on both, which gives you four potential profiles.
Okay, let's walk through them. What about the failure avoiding group?
Okay, these individuals are high in avoidance motivation but low in approach motivation.
Yep.
Their primary driver is fear. Learning is valued mainly as a way to avoid demonstrating incompetence.
So, success for them is just not failing.
Pretty much. It's driven by negative reinforcement, the relief of not failing, rather than the joy of succeeding. In a competitive setting, grades become direct measures of their worth, which likely undermines any intrinsic interest. There's, as the researchers put it, scant emotional consolation in defining success merely as the absence of failure.
Oof. Okay, then the opposite, success-oriented.
Right. High approach, low avoidance. These are the folks who genuinely appreciate their achievements for the personal satisfaction they bring. Learning is valued.
And how do grades fit in for them?
Grades are seen more as useful feedback, confirming their mastery or indicating areas for improvement. So external rewards like grades can actually be complementary to their intrinsic goals, reinforcing their sense of competence and progress.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the overstrivers?
Ah, the overstrivers. They're high in both approach motivation and avoidance motivation. They desperately want to succeed, but they're also intensely afraid of failing.
So they try to avoid failure by achieving high levels of success.
Exactly. It's a very conflicted state. They might achieve a lot, driven by both the hope of success, pride, and the fear of failure, relief. But it can feel like being on a never-ending treadmill, as the researchers described it, always running, driven by both positive and negative forces.
Wow, that sounds exhausting. And the last group, failure accepting.
This group is low in both approach and avoidance. Often, due to repeated experiences of failure, they've essentially given up on trying to maintain their self-worth through academic achievement.
So they're kind of indifferent?
Largely, yes. They're not strongly motivated by the hope of success, nor are they intensely anxious about failure anymore. As a result, traditional motivational strategies threatening them with bad grades or offering positive reinforcement tend to have little impact. They've become disengaged.
This quadrupolar model really paints a much richer picture than just intrinsic versus extrinsic, doesn't it? It shows how complex the interplay is, and how the same external factor, like grades, can have vastly different effects depending on the person's underlying motivational profile, especially their level of fear.
Absolutely. And this understanding then leads back to rethinking how rewards function. The research suggests that when the reasons for learning are primarily task-oriented, driven by intrinsic interest and approach goals, tangible rewards don't necessarily have to be detrimental.
They might even enhance motivation.
They might. Remember the magician getting paid. If the reward supports or enables the intrinsically valued activity, it can be positive. The key seems to be whether the reward feels controlling or informational labeling.
And they also found something interesting about assignments with extra payoffs, right?
Yes. Students reported being more willing to invest extra effort when an assignment had some additional tangible payoff that was still aligned with intrinsic goals, things like getting to share their work with others or explaining its personal relevance.
So, a reward that reinforces the meaning or value of the task itself.
Exactly. And this led the researchers to wonder, maybe the absence of payoffs that reinforce the importance and value of deep engagement is actually more discouraging to learning than the mere presence of tangible rewards. It kind of challenges that intense focus solely on the potential negative over-justification effect.
That's a really interesting point, that maybe we worry too much about rewards killing motivation and not enough about whether the learning environment provides meaningful validation for engagement.
Precisely.
Okay, what else did they look at? You mentioned the impact of actually achieving goals and the student's interest level.
Right. They dug into that interaction. How does succeeding at your grade goals versus failing interact with how interested you are in the subject in terms of how much you end up valuing the learning experience.
And what did they find?
Couple of key things. First, actually achieving the grade goals you set for yourself tended to increase how much students valued the learning, and this happened regardless of their initial interest level. Success bred more appreciation.
Okay, success matters. What about interest?
Higher initial interest in the subject also led to greater appreciation of the learning experience, regardless of whether the student ultimately succeeded or failed in meeting their grade goal.
So interest has its own power.
It does. And crucially, they found that this positive influence of interest could actually offset the negative impact of failing to meet a grade goal, at least in terms of how much the student valued the learning afterward.
Wow, so interest provides a kind of buffer against failure, helping maintain appreciation for the subject matter itself.
It seems so. And the best case scenario, when success and interest came together, achieving your goals in a subject you were already interested in led to the greatest subsequent appreciation for the learning.
That synergy effect.
Exactly. Which, again, suggests that if you can foster both interest and help students achieve meaningful success, concerns about over-justification might be less warranted. Success seemed to make the material more interesting, not less.
Did students have explanations for why success boosted their interest or appreciation?
Yeah, they mentioned things like success leading to positive emotions, feeling good about themselves, which naturally makes the subject more appealing. It also reduced their fear of future failure in that area, freeing them up to engage more openly. And sometimes, the process of studying hard to succeed actually made the material click and become more interesting.
That makes intuitive sense. It wasn't just about the grade itself, but the feeling of competence and reduced anxiety that came with it.
Right. And interestingly, both the success-oriented students and those more threatened by failure showed this capacity for increased intrinsic engagement following success. The differences were more relative than absolute.
Okay, so where does this leave future research? What directions did they see opening up?
Well, a key shift is moving beyond just looking at traditional academic outcomes,
Yeah.
like test performance or how much information is retained, to also explicitly include motivational and effective goals, like fostering subject matter appreciation.
Measuring not just what students learn, but how they feel about learning it.
Exactly. They're building on findings that environments where rewards feel scarce or competition is intense often lead to those avoidance strategies we talked about, which can hurt both performance and appreciation.
And this led them to experiment with different grading structures. You mentioned the grade choice arrangement.
Yes, this is essentially a mastery learning setup. Instead of competing against each other for a limited number of A's, students work towards a grade they choose, A, B, etc., based on meeting absolute performance standards. If you meet the standard for an A, you get an A.
Taking away the curve, essentially, less zero-sum competition.
Right. And preliminary findings showed students under this kind of system actually tended to outperform students under more traditional competitive grading rules.
Why would that be?
They hypothesize a few reasons that might also boost appreciation. One, it reduces the negative influence of those avoidance goals because failure is less public and less relative. Two, it makes the link between effort and payoff clearer and feel fairer. Three, students are more likely to achieve the subjective grade goals they set for themselves, leading to those positive effects of success we just discussed.
So they plan to track whether this grade choice system actually leads to greater appreciation over time.
Yes, that's a key goal. They want to see if it fosters that positive synergy between performance gains and increased appreciation.
Any other areas they're exploring?
They're also interested in the impact of student choice, allowing students more say in how they demonstrate their learning or how different assignments are weighted. And they're even considering experimenting with rewarding reflection, giving students extra grade credit, for instance, for reflecting thoughtfully on their learning process or finding personal meaning in the material.
Using an extrinsic reward, grade credit, to hopefully nurture intrinsic involvement, reflection, meaning-making. That sounds like a bit of a gamble, given the over-justification concerns.
It is. They acknowledge it's a delicate balance,
Oh.
but it comes back to that idea of the purpose of the reward. If the reward is structured to encourage and validate deeper, more intrinsically valuable engagement, maybe it can be a catalyst rather than an inhibitor. It's an open question they want to explore.
So, wrapping this all up, the big takeaway seems to be that this relationship between motivation and learning is really complex. It's definitely not a simple good versus bad story when it comes to intrinsic and extrinsic factors.
Not at all. The reasons behind why a learner is doing something, and the specific features of the learning environment, how competitive it is, how feedback is given, how much choice there is, all seem incredibly important.
Understanding these nuances seems absolutely key if we want to foster not just high performance, but also that genuine, lasting appreciation for learning itself, rather than just encouraging a focus on external validation.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so that leaves us, and maybe our listeners, with a final thought to chew on.
Mhm.
Take a moment to think about the learning environments you encounter, maybe in your own education, your workplace, even your hobbies or personal development efforts. Do those environments tend to foster more of an approach focus, encouraging growth and genuine interest? Or do they, maybe unintentionally, push people towards avoidance, fear, and focusing solely on hitting external targets? And perhaps more importantly, what small shifts might help tilt that balance towards more positive, appreciative engagement with learning? Definitely something worth considering. Thanks for diving deep with us today.